The throne had not moved in 300 years. Kings had been crowned upon it, treaties signed beside it, proclamations issued from it, but the throne itself never moved. It was as fixed as the mountains, as permanent as the sun's rising, until the day King Valen ascended to rule, and everything changed. The coronation ceremony was traditional in every way. Valen, 28 years old and newly ascended after his father's death, walked the ceremonial path through the great hall, acknowledged the assembled nobles and advisers. The high priest placed the crown upon his head, spoke the ancient words of binding, and gestured for Valen to sit. Valen sat, and the moment he did, the throne moved. It was not a dramatic shift, no earthquake, no explosion of magic, no visible light or sound. But everyone in the great hall felt it. The throne slid backward 3 inches, as though rejecting him, as though pushing him away. And Valen, crown newly placed upon his head, felt something tear in his throat. He tried to speak, to ask what had happened, to demand an explanation. But no sound emerged. His mouth moved, his throat worked, his lungs pushed air, but there was no voice. Complete, absolute silence. The high priest stared at him in horror. The assembled court erupted in confused murmurs. And Valen, newly crowned king, sat on a throne that had rejected him, unable to speak, unable to explain, unable to understand what had just happened. The healers were summoned immediately. They examined Valen's throat, checked for injury or illness, applied every treatment they knew. But there was nothing physically wrong with him. His vocal cords were intact, his throat was healthy, his lungs functioned perfectly. He simply could not produce sound. It was as though his voice had been stolen, severed, removed by magic, rather than by any physical cause. And the throne continued to move, sometimes a foot, always away from where Valen sat, always with that same sense of rejection. By evening, the throne had moved nearly 15 feet from its original position, and Valen had resorted to writing every word he needed to communicate. The advisers convened an emergency session, and their conclusion was grim. They only record that when rejection happens, the king must either prove themselves worthy again or abdicate. King Aldrich chose abdication after 3 months. His voice returned the moment he stepped down. "I will not abdicate," Valen wrote, his hands shaking with anger and fear. "I was meant to rule. My father prepared me my entire life. The throne's rejection is a mistake. With respect, Your Majesty, the throne does not make mistakes. If it has rejected you, there is a reason. We must discover that reason and address it." But discovering the reason proved impossible. Valen governed as best he could, writing instructions, communicating through messengers, making decisions that were implemented by advisers who could speak. But the throne continued to move, continued to reject him, and his inability to speak became increasingly problematic. A king needed a voice. Without voice, Valen felt himself becoming invisible, felt his authority draining away as people spoke over him, around him, about him, but never with him. He was present but voiceless, crowned but powerless, king in title, but increasingly irrelevant in practice. She requested an audience with the king, and Valen, desperate for any insight into his condition, agreed immediately. She entered the throne room carrying several ancient books. "I believe I can help you understand why it has rejected you," Valen wrote. "Tell me." The throne does not judge worthiness based on character or capability. It judges based on willingness to listen. The throne removes their voice because they were not using it to communicate, but to dominate. Do you? Or do you listen for flaws in their reasoning so you can dismiss suggestions that differ from what you have already decided? Refused to consider that perhaps your father's approach needed revision. The throne sensed this, sensed that you had stopped truly listening, and it rejected you. Valen felt anger surge through him. He wrote quickly, aggressively. My father was a great king. His policies built prosperity. I was right to continue them. Your father was a great king for his time, but times change. What worked 20 years ago may not work now. Your refusal to acknowledge this, your insistence that loyalty to your father's memory meant never questioning his methods, that is what the throne rejected, not your character. How can you be certain? Because the throne is moving away from you. If you were speaking less, listening more, accepting that you do not have all answers, the throne would move closer. Instead, it moves farther each day, telling you that you have learned nothing, that you still believe your voice is the only one that matters despite having lost it. Valen sat silent, the only silence available to him now, and he felt Myra's words cutting through his defenses. Was she right? He thought back over his first 2 months as king, tried to remember the council meetings, the advisor's suggestions, his own responses, and he realized with sick certainty that she was right. He had been going through the motions of listening, sitting through meetings, had already committed to continuing his father's approach, and nothing anyone said could have changed his mind because he was not actually open to changing it. He had stopped listening before he ever became king. And the throne had noticed. He wrote to Myra, "How do I fix this? How do I prove to the throne that I can listen?" You stop performing listening and start actually doing it. You acknowledge that you do not know everything. You accept that voices other than yours may have wisdom you lack. You make decisions not based on what you think should work, but based on evidence of what actually is working. And you do this genuinely, not as performance to satisfy the throne, but because you recognize it is the right way to lead. And if I do this, my voice will return, perhaps. Or perhaps the throne has decided you need to learn how to govern without voice, how to lead by listening rather than speaking. Or you can change fundamentally and completely and discover what kind of king you are capable of being. Valen dismissed her from the throne room, but her words stayed with him. That night, unable to sleep, he reviewed every decision he had made since taking the crown, and he saw with brutal clarity that he had been ruling based on assumptions rather than reality, based on what he believed should be true rather than what actually was true. His father's trade policies were failing because the economic landscape had changed. His father's military strategy was outdated because the threats had evolved. His father's approach to taxation was creating hardship because the kingdom's demographics had shifted. When they assembled, he wrote a message and had it read aloud. "I have been a poor king. I have been so committed to honoring my father's legacy that I stopped seeing the kingdom as it actually is. I want to hear, truly hear, what needs to change, and I will not defend past decisions or dismiss concerns. I will listen." They told him about the trade policies that were strangling small merchants, about the military deployments that were wasting resources, about the tax structures that were pushing families into poverty. He sat silent, forced into silence by the throne's judgment, and he heard his kingdom in a way he had never heard it before. When they finished, he wrote, "Revise the trade policies. Provide relief for families suffering under current taxation. Redeploy military forces to address actual threats rather than theoretical ones." The advisors implemented his instructions. And that evening, when Valen sat on the throne, it moved for the first time in a different direction, not away, but toward. Just an inch, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. The throne was responding. He was being heard, not by speaking, but by listening. Not by listening. Over the following weeks, Valen transformed how he governed. Every morning, he would meet with different groups, merchants, farmers, soldiers, craftspeople, and he would listen to their concerns without defending current policies or explaining why things were the way they were. He would simply hear them, take notes, and consider what they told him. The change was dramatic and disorienting. Before losing his voice, Valen had approached every meeting with an agenda, with points he wanted to make, with conclusions he wanted to reach. He would listen only long enough to find openings for his own arguments, would interrupt when discussions went in directions he had not anticipated, would redirect conversations toward outcomes he had already decided were correct. Now, voiceless, he could not do any of that, and it was terrifying. He felt powerless, irrelevant, as though he was watching governance happen around him rather than directing it himself. But people responded to his silence in unexpected ways. Merchants who had previously given him carefully rehearsed presentations began speaking more honestly. Farmers who had been intimidated by royal authority began describing problems in detail rather than just asking for generic assistance. And they told him things they had never told his father, things they would never have said to a king who could respond immediately with dismissal or correction. The merchants told him about trade restrictions that made sense in theory, but created impossible situations in practice. How inspection requirements that seemed reasonable were actually prohibitively expensive for family businesses. Valen had heard complaints about these policies before, but he had always responded by explaining why the policies were necessary, by defending the logic behind them, by suggesting that merchants who struggled were simply not adapting properly. Now, unable to defend or explain, he simply listened. And he began to understand that the problem was not that merchants were failing to adapt, it was that the policies themselves were flawed, were creating the struggles they were meant to prevent. The farmers told him about agricultural quotas that were based on outdated assessments of land productivity. They explained how weather patterns had changed, how soil conditions had shifted, how the kingdom's expectations for crop yields were no longer realistic given actual conditions. Between satisfying immediate demands and preserving their land for future generations. Valen had dismissed these concerns when they had been raised before, had suggested that farmers were making excuses for poor management, had insisted that if his father's quotas had been met in the past, they could be met again. Now, listening without the ability to interrupt or contradict, the soldiers told him about deployments that made no strategic sense. Valen had believed his father's military strategy was sound, had resisted suggestions that it needed revision, had interpreted soldiers' complaints as insubordination rather than as valuable intelligence. Now, forced to listen without defending, he recognized that the soldiers were not questioning authority. They were trying to protect the kingdom by pointing out that current approaches were failing. He learned that the kingdom was struggling in ways he had not understood, would recognize that problems he had thought were isolated were actually systemic, and he would write new instructions to his advisors, instructions that addressed what people had actually said rather than what he wished they had said. He revised trade policies to account for the realities merchants had described. Some advisors resisted, arguing that these changes undermined regulatory frameworks that had been carefully constructed. But Valen wrote back, the frameworks were constructed for different circumstances. He adjusted agricultural quotas to reflect actual land conditions rather than historical expectations, gave farmers flexibility to choose sustainable practices over short-term yields. But Valen wrote, forcing unsustainable production will reduce food production more severely in the long term. We adjust now or we create famine later. He redesigned military deployments based on actual threat assessments rather than on inherited strategies, redirected resources from performative displays of strength to practical security measures, rather than requiring adherence to central plans that ignored local realities. Some advisors warned this would weaken command authority. But Valen wrote, authority that ignores reality is not strong, it is brittle. We must trust those who see the ground truth. And each day, as he listened more and spoke less, spoke not at all. In fact, the throne moved closer. The court watched this transformation with mixed reactions, and the kingdom was improving as a result. Valen wrote his response and had it read to the full council. My father was a great king, but he governed in his time, not in ours. I honored him by trying to continue his methods unchanged, but that honor was false. It clung to memory rather than adapting to reality. That what worked then may not work now, that my duty is to the living kingdom, not to preserving the past. The advisors who had urged reassertion of control were not satisfied with this answer. One, a man named Corvin, who had been among his father's closest counselors, approached him privately. Your Majesty, Corvin said, careful, formal, I understand that losing your voice has been difficult. The throne will return when you reassert proper authority. Valen wrote, the throne moved away when I stopped truly listening. It is returning because I am learning to listen again. If you believe that is weakness, then you misunderstand what the throne requires. The scholar woman has filled your head with theories, but the scholar woman has helped me understand what I was doing wrong, and the evidence proves she was correct. Every time I genuinely listen, every time I act on what people actually need rather than on what I believe they should need, the throne moves closer. This is not theory. This is observable fact. But at what cost? You are undermining the very foundations of royal authority. Valen looked at Corvin for a long moment, then wrote, royal authority that cannot tolerate being questioned is not authority. It is tyranny waiting to emerge. Corvin left dissatisfied, and over the following weeks, several other advisors who shared his views resigned from the council. Valen let them go without attempting to change their minds. He appointed new advisors to replace them, some scholars. Mira visited him regularly during this transformation. She would review the throne's position, now only 3 feet from its original location, and she would assess his progress with approval. Mira visited him regularly during this transformation. She would review the throne's position, now only 3 feet from its original location, and she would assess his progress with approval tempered by continued challenge. "You are doing better," she told him one afternoon, 3 months into his silent reign, sitting across from him in his private study where they could speak or write without court formality. "But there is more. The throne does not just want you to hear words. It wants you to hear what is beneath words, the emotions, the needs, the truths people cannot articulate clearly. You must learn to listen with more than ears." Valen wrote, "How do I do that without voice? How do I ask clarifying questions, draw out what people are not saying? You watch their faces. You note their body language, the pauses in their speech, the topics they avoid, the emotions that flash across their features when certain subjects arise. And you give them time. Silence allows people to think, to find words for feelings they have not named, to work through their own thoughts rather than just responding to yours. When you could speak, you filled silences immediately, never letting moments extend, never giving people space to process and articulate. Now you must." Valen began practicing this deeper listening. He noticed when merchants spoke confidently about business problems, but became hesitant when discussion turned to their families, suggesting that policy failures were creating personal crises they were ashamed to acknowledge. He noticed when farmers described crop failures with resignation that hinted at deeper despair. He would write questions that got at emotions rather than just facts. What are you most afraid of? What keeps you awake at night? What would help most, not what you think you should say, but what you actually need? They told him about shame and fear and desperation that policy discussions never captured, about the human cost of decisions that looked reasonable on parchment, but created suffering in reality. One merchant, a woman who supplied grain to the capital, broke down crying during a meeting when Valen asked what she was most afraid of. "That I will lose my business and prove my father right," she said through tears. "I spent 15 years proving him wrong, building something that worked. And now your policies, your father's policies, are destroying me, not because—" Valen felt her words like a physical blow. He never considered that policy could carry such personal weight, that trade regulations could become evidence in intimate family conflicts, that his decisions about guild advantages could destroy not just a business, but someone's entire sense of self-worth. He wrote, "You will not fail." He revised trade policies more aggressively after that conversation, explicitly targeting advantages that guild merchants had been exploiting. The throne moved another 6 inches closer, now less than 2 feet from its original position, and Valen understood that each act of genuine listening. 6 months into his silent reign, the northern provinces began organizing what looked like a rebellion, arguing that rebellion could not be tolerated, that showing weakness would encourage other regions to follow the northern province's example, that strength was the only language rebels understood. Other advisors nodded agreement, and written recommendations for military intervention piled up on the table in front of Valen. The message was clear. This was what kings did, and he noticed something the advisors had not mentioned: the specific demands buried in the aggressive rhetoric. They wanted representation in the royal council, which had never included anyone from their region. They wanted relief from tax burdens that they claimed were disproportionately heavy compared to southern provinces. Valen wrote a question and had it read to the council. Why are they rebelling? Not what they are doing, but why. What has driven them to this? The advisors looked uncomfortable. One said carefully, "They are rebelling because they are defying legitimate authority." Rebellions do not emerge from nowhere. People do not risk everything out of casual defiance. Something has driven them to this point, and we must understand what before we respond with violence. Your Majesty, with respect, understanding their grievances can wait until after the rebellion is crushed. Or other provinces will see that we address legitimate grievances rather than suppressing them with force, that we listen even to those who challenge us. That rebellion may be wrong, but that what drives people to rebel may be real problems we have failed to address. The council debated for hours, with most advisors insisting that military force was the only viable response. But Valen kept writing the same question in different forms. Why are they rebelling? Finally, Myra, who had been sitting silently observing, spoke up. Your Majesty has lost his voice, but has learned to listen. It was too dangerous, too risky, too degrading for a king to travel to rebels as though seeking their approval. But Valen felt the rightness of Myra's suggestion immediately. He wrote, "I will go to the northern provinces, without an army, without threats. They will capture you, hold you hostage, make demands we cannot meet. Then they will have a hostage who cannot speak and who will listen to everything they say. I do not believe they want a hostage. I believe they want to be heard, and I will give them that." He departed 3 days later, taking only a small escort, and bringing no weapons, no soldiers, no show of force. The journey north took 9 days, and during that time the north had always been the kingdom's poorest region, and royal attention had focused on the prosperous south, treating the north as a resource source rather than as a community of people deserving equal concern. They had expected an army, had prepared for war, and the arrival of a silent king with a tiny escort confused them. "You come without soldiers," one leader said. A woman named Kara, who had been elected spokesperson for the rebellion. "Without threats, what does the silent king want?" Valen wrote on parchment he had brought, "I want to understand why you are rebelling. I want to hear what has driven you to this. I want to understand your truth." Kara read his words aloud to the assembled leaders, and they exchanged glances of disbelief. One man said, "This is a trick. He wants us to reveal our plans, our weaknesses." And gradually, cautiously, they began speaking. They told him about infrastructure that had been crumbling for decades, while southern provinces received constant investment. They described roads that made trade nearly impossible, bridges that had collapsed and never been repaired, requests for assistance that had been denied or ignored, promises of future investment that had never materialized. They told him about tax structures that treated the North as a resource colony, extracting wealth to fund Southern prosperity while providing minimal services in return. They showed him the calculations Northern taxes per capita were 30% higher than Southern taxes, despite Northern incomes being 40% lower. They showed him the council roster 42 members, not one from the North, despite the North containing 1/5 of the kingdom's population, while Southern population had grown by 30%. Had not recognized that his father's focus on Southern development had come at the North's expense. On the third evening, Kara said to him, "You have listened. You have written questions that suggest you actually hear us. But listening means nothing without action. Will you address what we have told you?" Valen wrote his response carefully. knowing that this moment would determine whether rebellion became war or whether understanding could create peace. You are right. The northern provinces have been neglected, have been treated as resources rather than as communities deserving equal concern. Your rebellion is not treason, but desperation. 20 years of neglect cannot be reversed in a day. But I can commit to fair treatment, to investing in your infrastructure, to including northern voices in governance, to treating you as partners rather than as subjects to be managed. And I can do this not as concession to rebellion, but as acknowledgement that you deserve better governance than you have received. He then wrote specific commitments, immediate allocation of funds for critical infrastructure repairs, creation of economic development programs designed to stop population decline by creating opportunities in the north rather than forcing people to move south. The rebel leaders read his commitments, consulted with each other, argued about whether to trust him. Finally, Kara said, "These words are better than we expected, but words are easy. How do we know you will keep these promises?" Valen wrote, "Because I am committing them in writing in front of witnesses in a document that you will keep and that I will have delivered to every corner of the kingdom. If I break these commitments, everyone will know. My credibility as king depends on following through, and more than that I have learned, painfully, that governance requires listening to truth even when truth is uncomfortable. You have told me the truth about northern suffering. I cannot unhear it. They negotiated for 2 more days, working out specifics, establishing timelines and accountability mechanisms, creating structures to ensure that promises would become reality rather than being quietly abandoned once immediate crisis passed. Who had discovered that sometimes the best response was not asserting authority, but acknowledging legitimate grievances. When Valen returned to the capital, he found that the throne had moved. It now sat exactly where it had sat for 300 years, accepting him fully, acknowledging that he had learned what it needed him to learn. He opened his mouth and sound emerged. Not his full voice, it was rough, uncertain, weak, as though he had not spoken in years rather than months. But it was there, undeniably present, returned to him by a throne that had judged him worthy again. His words were barely audible, scratchy, but they were his own. The throne did not respond. It did not need to. It had made its point. Valen's voice returned slowly over the following weeks, strengthening gradually as he continued to govern in the new way he had learned. But he was careful, almost obsessively careful, never to let voice become dominance again, never to let speaking replace listening. He established new protocols for council meetings. Every meeting would begin with 30 minutes of silence, during which advisors would write their concerns and observations without interruption. Only after everyone had been given time to think and write would discussion begin, would treat his role as synthesis rather than proclamation. Some advisors found this approach strange, even uncomfortable. They were accustomed to kings who spoke first, who set agendas, who directed conversations. But Valen insisted. "I lost my voice because I forgot how to listen. I will not make that mistake again. That discomfort is worth it to ensure we hear truths that might otherwise be silenced by my authority." He also instituted what he called listening tours, regular trips, the attention to what was beneath words, the patience to let silences extend. During one such tour in the western provinces, he met an elderly woman who had lost her farm to debt. She told him about policies that seemed reasonable when written, but that created impossible situations for family farmers, about watching her children inherit nothing because systems designed to prevent exploitation had somehow made exploitation easier. Dad understood I was trying my best. That gave me time to recover instead of treating one bad harvest as evidence I was a bad farmer. I would have repaid everything eventually. I just needed time. Then we will build mercy into the system, Valen said, his voice still rough but growing stronger. We will create flexibility for farmers facing circumstances beyond their control. He returned to the capital and worked with his advisors to reform agricultural debt policies, creating mechanisms for debt forgiveness in catastrophic situations. Creditors objected that they created moral hazard, that they encouraged farmers to be irresponsible, knowing they could escape consequences. But Valen countered, the purpose of economic policy is not to punish irresponsibility, but to enable prosperity. If our systems are destroying family farms that could be viable with reasonable support, then our systems are failing. We adjust them. These small changes accumulated over months and years transformed the kingdom. Just steady, consistent governance that listened before acting, that valued truth over pride, that prioritized understanding over authority. The throne never moved again. It remained in its proper position, accepting Valen, approving of the king he had become. But Valen never became complacent, never assumed that acceptance was permanent. Mira stayed in the capital, becoming not just his advisor but his conscience, the person who would remind him whenever he started slipping back into old patterns, whenever he began believing his voice was more important than his ears, when he would feel the old impulse to speak first and listen second. The throne is watching, she would remind him quietly. It gave you back your voice. Do not make it regret that gift. And Valen would stop himself, would consciously choose silence, would create space for others to speak. Not because he feared losing his voice again, though he did fear that, but because he had come to understand that listening was not weakness but strength, not passivity but active engagement with truth. He ruled for 34 years, and during that time the kingdom transformed in subtle but profound ways. Governance became more responsive, more adaptive, more grounded in reality rather than in abstract principles. Policies changed when evidence showed they were failing rather than being maintained out of institutional inertia. Mistakes were acknowledged and corrected rather than defended and perpetuated. Foreign diplomats noted the change, remarked that negotiating with Valen's kingdom was different from negotiating with other monarchies. Your king actually listens, one ambassador told Valen's diplomatic corps. He asks questions as though he genuinely wants to understand our perspective, rather than just waiting for his turn to argue. It is unusual. The kingdom prospered, not because Valen was a brilliant strategist or a charismatic leader, but because he had learned to hear truth and respond to it. He made fewer mistakes than most rulers because he listened to warnings before they became catastrophes. He implemented better policies because he heard from those affected before finalizing decisions. He inspired loyalty because people felt heard, felt that their concerns mattered, felt that the king saw them as individuals rather than as statistics. When he died, peacefully, at 62, the kingdom mourned a king who had been silent and had learned from that silence. Myra was with him at the end, holding his hand as his breathing slowed. "The throne punished me, but you taught me what the punishment meant." "The throne did not punish you," Mira said gently. "It educated you. There is a difference. Punishment seeks to cause suffering. Education seeks to create understanding. The throne took your voice so you would learn to listen. That was gift, not cruelty. It felt like cruelty at the time. Losing voice, being unable to speak, feeling powerless. Because you believed voice was power. The throne showed you that listening is power, that silence can be stronger than speech, that creating space for others is more valuable than filling space with your own words. That lesson was painful, but necessary, and you learned it well." Valen smiled weakly. "I learned it, but I had to be broken first." "Yes, that is why the throne moved. It broke you so you could be rebuilt into something better. And you were. You became the king the kingdom needed. Not the king your father was. Not the king you thought you should be. But the king who listened, who created space, who understood that leadership was about service rather than dominance." "Tell them," Valen said, his breathing becoming labored, "tell the next rulers. Tell them what the throne taught me. Tell them that if they want to keep their voice, they must learn to be silent, must learn to listen, must learn that speaking is not the most important thing a king can do. I will tell them. I will make sure your story is remembered, not as tragedy of a king who lost his voice." Valen died with those words in his ears, with Mira's hand in his, with the knowledge that the throne had accepted him, that he had learned its lesson, that he had become worthy of the crown he wore. I would not have learned to listen any other way. The new king, Valen's nephew, who had been trained in Valen's methods, read those words on his coronation day, and when he sat on the throne for the first time, he remained silent for 10 full minutes before speaking his first words as king. The throne did not move. The throne never moved again during the following generations. The lesson had been learned, had been passed down, had become part of how rulers were trained. Kings and queens were taught that voice was a tool, not a weapon, that listening was power, that silence could be more valuable than speech. Every new ruler, before their coronation, would spend a month in what became known as the silent retreat, a period where they would travel the kingdom without speaking, communicating only through writing, practicing the enforced listening that had transformed Valen. They would meet with people from all walks of life, would hear complaints and concerns without being able to defend or explain, would learn what Valen had learned about how silence created space for truth. Some found the experience frustrating, chafed at being unable to speak, felt diminished by being forced to listen without responding immediately. That governance required humility they could only develop by experiencing what it felt like to be voiceless. One young heir, a woman named Alara, who became queen 50 years after Valen's death, wrote about her silent retreat experience. "I hated every moment of the first week. I felt powerless, irrelevant, as though my inability to speak made me invisible. But by the second week, I began to notice things I had never noticed before. When I could not interrupt, people spoke more honestly. When I could not redirect conversations, truths emerged that I would have unconsciously suppressed. When I could not defend current policies, I heard criticisms that I would have dismissed if I could have argued back. The silence was torture because it prevented me from controlling discourse, but that control was exactly what I needed to surrender." The silent retreat became one of the kingdom's most important traditions, was studied by scholars from other realms who were fascinated by how a single king's experience had transformed an entire nation's approach to leadership. Your rulers ask questions as though they do not already know all answers, one ambassador told the Royal Diplomatic Corps. They listen to our concerns as though they matter. They make concessions not out of weakness, but out of genuine recognition that we might have valid points. It is strange. Effective, but strange. But the story of the silent king who lost his voice remains central to royal education, was told to every heir, was remembered as the moment when the kingdom's understanding of leadership fundamentally changed. Mera lived for another 23 years after Valen's death, serving 3 more rulers as advisor on matters of listening and governance. She expanded her original research into a comprehensive text about the throne's history, its magic, its relationship to rulers, analyzing what they had in common, what the throne was trying to teach. Her conclusion was clear. The throne rejected kings who believed they were meant to command rather than serve, who saw their voices as more important than their subjects' voices, who governed through authority rather than through understanding. It was not about capability or character. Many rejected kings had been intelligent and well-intentioned. It was about willingness to listen, about recognizing that leadership required humility, about understanding that power should be used to elevate others' voices rather than to silence them. The throne is not cruel, Myra wrote in her final work, completed shortly before her death. It is demanding. To overcome the human impulse to speak rather than listen, to dominate rather than collaborate. King Valen believed the throne was punishing him, but punishment implies arbitrary suffering. The throne was educating him, forcing him to learn something essential that he could not have learned any other way. Every moment of his voiceless months served a purpose. Every instance of frustration taught him something about governance he had not understood. The throne took his voice not to harm him, but to save him from becoming a king who harmed others through his inability to hear them. Her text became required reading for all rulers, and was eventually published for the general population, transforming how the entire kingdom understood leadership. Citizens began expecting their leaders to listen, began holding rulers accountable when they governed through authority rather than understanding. The transformation was not perfect. There were still bad rulers, still mistakes, still policies that failed or caused harm. But the culture of governance had changed fundamentally. Listening was valued, silence was respected, and leaders who believed their voices were most important were quickly reminded. 100 years after Valen's death, a young scholar wrote a retrospective. King Valen did not conquer new territories, did not win great wars, did not build monuments that still stand. He simply learned to listen. He proved that the greatest leadership innovation is not new strategies or bold proclamations, but genuine humility. That the most powerful thing a ruler can do is create space for truth to emerge. We remember him not as the silent king who lost his voice, but as the listening king who found his purpose. And that legacy endures, stronger than any monument, more valuable than any conquest, more transformative than any war. The throne had moved, and in moving it had taught a lesson that echoed through centuries, that the best leaders are not those who speak most eloquently, but those who listen most deeply, not those who command most forcefully, but those who create space most generously. Not those who believe they have all answers, but those who seek truth wherever it can be found. Valen had been broken by the throne's rejection, but in breaking he had learned, and in losing it he found what he had never known he needed: the ability to hear truth, the courage to be wrong, the wisdom to let others speak while he listened. And that made all the difference. This has been a story of voices lost and wisdom gained, of silence as teacher and listening as power. When should leaders speak and when should they listen? Can silence be more powerful than voice? What does it mean to create space for others to be heard? Your reflections give these stories meaning, and I would be honored to hear them. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of the silent bond, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, so you may return when the next story is told, when another throne judges, and when silence perhaps teaches once more.